Have we truly accepted the official narrative of our origins, or does a quieter, more insistent doubt persist in the deepest corners of our collective memory? It is a question that requires silence to answer, a question that begs us to look not just at what history records, but what it meticulously attempts to conceal through normalization. We are asked to accept the rise of civilization as a swift, linear progression, springing forth from the Fertile Crescent like a rapid bloom after a sudden rain. Yet when we dare to look closely at the primary texts, the very foundation stones upon which our understanding of the ancient world is built, we encounter an immediate, profound, and destabilizing anomaly. It is an anomaly measured not in centuries, but in vast geological epochs of time, stretching the credulity of the modern mind until it snaps, forcing a choice between the familiar comfort of conventional history and the terrifying, sprawling implications of the forgotten chronology. The feeling is one of intellectual vertigo, a curious sensation that the timeline itself is stretched and distorted, like an image seen through ancient cracked glass. We begin our investigation not with speculation, but with a document undeniably rooted in the physical past, a clay tablet whose existence is verified, cataloged, and housed in prestigious institutions, the Sumerian King List. This list, intended to chronicle the rulers of the earliest known civilization, begins not with familiar reigns of 20 or 50 years, but with astonishing, almost cosmic durations. If we recognize history as a series of reigns, then we must confront what the ancient Sumerians themselves claimed to be the foundation of their governance. Before the recognizable mortal rulers of Kish, Uruk, and Ur, there are names that resonate like thunder in the silence of deep time. Names like Alulim and Alalngar, who reigned in the city of Eridu, the first seat of kingship. But the duration ascribed to these early monarchs defies all biological and historical sense. We are not speaking of the exaggeration of a few decades. We are speaking of Shar, or periods of 60 Sars, where a Sar equaled 3,600 years. Alulim's reign is stated to have lasted 800 years. Alalngar followed with 36,000 years. This immediate and jarring incongruity creates the necessary estrangement from our preconceived notions. Why would meticulous record keepers, who later accurately recorded reigns lasting mere decades, insert such impossible figures at the very beginning of their lineage? Was it allegory, myth, or a literal accounting based on a reality we no longer understand, or perhaps actively choose to ignore? The traditional academic approach sweeps these colossal numbers into the bin of mythology, dismissing them as symbolic exaggeration, meant to legitimize later, shorter dynastic rules. But this lazy dismissal fails the intellectual rigor required by the subject. It ignores the fact that these impossible reigns are treated by the scribes with the same matter-of-fact detail as the later reigns of Sargon the Great or Gilgamesh. The text treats the pre-Diluvian era not as fantasy, but as history, a history defined by an entirely different perception of time, lifespan, and perhaps the nature of the rulers themselves. This recognition that the foundation of our civilization rests upon a document that describes rulers existing for tens of thousands of years introduces profound intellectual disquiet. It forces us to ask, what happens when the historical context we impose upon the past directly contradicts the testimony of the past itself? The King List proceeds with unwavering solemnity, noting each city where kingship was held and the length of each stupendous tenure, always punctuated by the chilling phrase, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This single demarcation is the core of the unease, the precise point where the timeline splits between the mythical and the merely ancient. Before the flood, 8 or 10 kings ruled for a combined total exceeding 241,000 years. If we allow the implications of this statement to settle, the true weight of the mystery begins to manifest. We are faced with a mathematical impossibility if we maintain these rulers were merely human beings in the modern sense. 28 millennia is a span that predates the recognized emergence of complex human agriculture, let alone organized urban society. It is a duration that challenges the very framework of human evolution as currently understood. What kind of consciousness, what kind of physiology could sustain such a reign? This realization that history might not be linear but rather cyclical, or perhaps governed by influences operating on a scale far removed from human temporality, is essential to unlocking the deeper narrative. The reigns before the flood act as colossal mile markers, signaling a period when the rules of existence were profoundly different. If you find yourself experiencing this unsettling shift in perspective, that sudden realization that the walls of history might be thinner than you thought, take a moment to absorb the data. This is not entertainment. This is an investigation into the buried strata of human consciousness. If the facts presented here resonate with a deep intuitive recognition, a feeling that this is the history we were meant to remember, then I invite you to share that feeling. Comment below with the word Eridu, the first city where kingship descended, as a marker of your curiosity. And if you wish to continue this descent into the prehistory of power, to follow this timeline as it unfolds across 8 distinct parts, ensure you are subscribed and engaged with this channel. This journey requires commitment, focus, and a willingness to see beyond the textbooks. The sharp shift in scale following the deluge is perhaps the most convincing argument that the king list, however strange, is attempting to describe a historical break rather than a merely symbolic one. Post-flood, the kings of Kish and Uruk begin to rule for periods vastly reduced, hundreds of years, then steadily diminishing to dozens. A reign of 100 years is considered long. A reign of 126 years is the new norm. It is as if the very breath of life, the vitality or longevity of the rulers, was dramatically curtailed by the catastrophic event. This is the gradual revelation beginning to surface. The early rulers were fundamentally different from their successors. They were, in the words of the text themselves, the intermediaries of the divine council, beings who held authority directly from the heavens. The texts refer to the fundamental concept of Nindana, divine command, and describe how kingship itself descended from heaven. This is not merely a poetic flourish, it is a foundational concept tied intrinsically to the origin of civilization. The first rulers were not local chieftains who seized power. They were custodians appointed by superior entities. And this leads us to the heart of the enigma, the name that has haunted historians and catalyzed countless esoteric investigations, the Anunnaki. This name, often rendered as those who from heaven to earth came, is not an invention of modern ufology. It is a direct translation from the Sumerian cuneiform, describing the very beings responsible for this initial impossible era of governance. They are the great observers and engineers of the first phase of human civilization, initiating systems that far outlasted their personal long reigns. If we accept the Sumerian scribes at face value, that beings capable of existing and ruling for millennia were the original architects of the first cities, then the entire historical timeline must be recalibrated. Why did they require such colossal lifespans for their rule? Why did a single king need 20 or 30,000 years on the throne? The scale of time suggests a task of cosmic proportions, not the simple organization of human resources. Perhaps their reigns were not solely about governing mortals, but about managing planetary cycles, establishing vast infrastructure, or overseeing genetic and civilizational seeding projects that required continuous, unchanging oversight. The length of the reign itself becomes evidence of their non-human nature and the nature of their mission. Their long reigns were perhaps synchronized with celestial cycles, a great return to a specific astrological or orbital alignment, marking the end of one governance cycle and the beginning of another. This opens up an unsettling line of inquiry regarding the nature of power and the roots of human servitude. Did the initial transfer of kingship from the Anunnaki to the post-flood human kings merely transfer authority, or did it transfer a system of control, inheritance and left behind by advanced beings operating on dimensions of time that dwarf our current existence? The evidence embedded in these ancient tablets, the records of ancient kings, long reigns, suggests that the timeline of the human experiment is far longer and far more complex than we are currently permitted to imagine. The pre-Diluvian era stands as a towering, silent monument to a history that was deliberately forgotten, or perhaps actively suppressed, to make way for a more manageable mortal narrative. The massive reigns act as a persistent signal screaming across millennia, telling us that the first phase of governance was transcendent. As we move forward, we must follow this Anunnaki timeline meticulously, examining the infrastructure, the religious claims, and the cultural memory left behind by these observers. The next stage of our investigation must delve deeply into the physical evidence connecting these impossibly long reigns to the actual geographical locations, the cities mentioned on the king list. We must ask, what happens when we analyze the archaeological footprint of Eridu and Bad Tibira? Do these ancient sites hold secrets that confirm the sheer age and scale of the pre-flood governance? The challenge is not in finding new information, but in daring to combine documents and disciplines that conventional scholarship keeps artificially separate. If history is cyclical, and the purpose of the long reign was tied to the anticipation of a grand cycle of return, then we must look to the heavens and the earth for synchronized clues. If you have stayed with us through this initial unsettling foundation, if the sound of these colossal reigns has truly shifted your perspective on history, then you are ready for the next phase of discovery. We are moving beyond the anomaly and into the architecture of the Anunnaki timeline. If you appreciate this deep cinematic dive into the world of forgotten history, please signal your support by liking this video and ensuring you are subscribed so you do not miss a single part of this unfolding epic. For those dedicated few who truly grasp the magnitude of these initial figures, I ask you to comment with the phrase, "The kingship descended," confirming your commitment to the long reign of truth. In our next segment, we move beyond the numbers and begin to trace the physical paths of these ancient rulers, examining the architecture of the first cities and the evidence that predates the flood. The descent of the kingship left indelible marks upon the earth, and those marks are waiting to be uncovered. What if the timeline we have been taught is merely a convenient fiction, a neat shelf upon which we organize a history too vast, too terrifyingly long to truly comprehend? We discussed the initial shock, the sheer statistical impossibility presented by the Sumerian king list, a document that chronicles reigns lasting 43,200 years for a single ruler, or 36,000 years for another, before the mythical Great Flood intervened. These are not just large numbers, they are a rejection of all known human biological and political limits. They demand an uncomfortable silence from the academic community, a silence often filled only by the dismissive, convenient label of mythology. Yet the very scribes who meticulously carved those vast numerals into the clay were the same scribes who later recorded the reigns of kings we know to be historically verifiable. The post-deluge rulers who lasted 18 years, 22 years, mirroring the fragile mortality we understand. The problem is not the mythology of the reigns themselves, but the strange, defiant juxtaposition of the physically impossible alongside the empirically proven, all residing on the very same tablet, compiled by the very same hand. It suggests that the author of this list did not perceive a break in the validity of the record, only a change in the nature of the rulers. The question ceases to be, did these kings truly exist for millennia? And transforms into the more profound, unsettling query, to whom or what did these timelines belong? The discomfort deepens when we recognize that these records were not isolated fantasies. They were foundational documents, replicated and referenced across the nascent Mesopotamian civilization. They provided legitimacy. They established a pedigree that reached back not just centuries, but into a depth of time that feels geological, astronomical. We must consider the implication that these reigns, stretching backward through what we perceive as prehistory, were perhaps recorded in a unit of time measurement wholly alien to our own daily reckoning. If a year or a cycle for these ancient observers was tied to a larger astronomical function, say, the full precession of the equinoxes or the orbital cycle of a large, infrequent planetary body, then the numbers, while still impossibly large for human existence, begin to speak the language of the cosmos rather than the language of earthly politics. They whisper of a non-human scale of life, a vast duration that suggests observation, planning, and administration, undertaken by beings whose lifespans transcended the petty constraints of our 70. The long reigns thus become a mathematical signature, a fingerprint left by a civilization fundamentally different from the short-lived, frantic endeavors of modern man. It is a moment of deep intellectual estrangement, forcing us to confront the possibility that the very beginning of civilization was managed, not by evolving hominids, but by entities operating on a different clock altogether. We stand at the precipice of recognizing that the foundation of our world might rest upon the temporal metrics of the Anunnaki, the beings whose very name is intrinsically linked to the descent of kingship itself. This investigation requires us to set aside the comfortable biases of modern science and to embrace the role of the perpetual inquirer, the one who dares to look beyond the approved footnotes. If these connections, this deliberate threading of the mythological and the historical, resonates with the silent questions you carry about the true origins of our past, then I invite you to join this inquiry fully. Pause for a moment and consider sharing your own deepest question about ancient history in the comments below. Your active participation helps to map this vast, forgotten landscape, ensuring that the full depth of this hidden narrative can continue to unfold. And if this journey into the profound strangeness of the deep past holds your interest, please leave a like and subscribe to accompany us through the remaining parts of this investigation. The specific tablets of the Sumerian king list are profoundly disquieting because of their material truth. They are not oral traditions filtered through centuries of biased recollection. They are bureaucratic records, painstakingly carved into durable clay. Scholars have long argued about whether the reigns were intentionally inflated, perhaps substituting a month for a year, in an effort to compress the timescale into something marginally more palatable. But this rationalization fails to hold up under scrutiny. The numbers are simply too vast, too consistent in their immense scale before the deluge, and too jarringly precise in their sudden reduction afterward. The difference is not gradual, it is catastrophic. It is the signature of two entirely different eras of existence. The pre-Diluvian period speaks to stability, to permanence, to a mandate that did not require frequent revalidation, because the rulers themselves were seemingly immortal, or at least operating under a time frame that rendered human generations meaningless. This brings us directly to the concept embedded within the text, the moment kingship descended from heaven. This phrase, often casually read as a metaphor for divine approval, must be re-examined through the lens of literal technology transfer. If these were not gods in the spiritual sense, but advanced, long-lived visitors, the very beings identified in later texts as the Anunnaki, then the descent was a physical landing, an installation of authority, knowledge, and perhaps, crucially, a genetic program for governance. What descended was not merely an abstract right to rule, but the tools necessary for sophisticated civilization, the blueprint for massive irrigation projects, the astronomical knowledge that allowed for precise calendar systems, and the mastery of metallurgy that seems to erupt almost fully formed in Sumer. It is a moment of profound recognition. The longest reigns belong to the administrators of a non-native system. Our immediate ancestors, the newly emerging human population, were the beneficiaries, or perhaps the subjects, of this imported administration. This idea takes on an unsettling clarity when we look at the ruins of the earliest Mesopotamian cities, Eridu, Shuruppak, cities listed in the king list as the seats of these antediluvian rulers. These were not primitive villages that slowly evolved. They were complex, organized urban centers, appearing abruptly with infrastructure designed for long-term survival in a harsh environment. They represent an immediate and high level of organizational genius that seems to have bypassed the necessary evolutionary stages of human development. We are forced to consider that the initial civilization was not built by humanity alone, but perhaps for humanity, under the strict supervision of these long-reigning architects. This leads us inevitably to the calculation of cycles, the attempt to find a non-human metric for the vastness of the reigns. If the Anunnaki, or the Shining Ones, as they were sometimes called, were tied to the orbit of a specific planetary body, the hypothetical Nibiru, as suggested by Zecharia Sitchin's controversial interpretations, then their period of active management on Earth would naturally correlate with that body's closest pass. The king list, therefore, becomes a historical log of their visitation cycle. A reign of 36,000 years might simply represent the passage of one or more of these immense cosmic cycles. The significance of the deluge, then, is not merely a biblical flood. It is the critical fracture in the Anunnaki timeline, the event that marked a necessary sudden withdrawal or a change in status. The flood separated the god-kings, who ruled in unbroken permanence, from the subsequent human kings, who were permitted only brief mortal stewardship. The waters did more than inundate the land. They washed away the immediate, visible evidence of the previous technological era, forcing humanity to begin again, but with the indelible memory of those who came before. The enduring mythologies, echoed across disparate cultures, from the Sumerian accounts to the Mayan calendars and the Hindu yugas, all speak of great ages separated by cataclysms, followed by a reseeding of knowledge. The long reigns of the pre-deluge kings are the historical record of the First Age. When we examine the sudden post-deluge reduction in lifespan and reign duration, it suggests an alteration of the original administrative plan, perhaps reflecting a reduction in direct supervision or, most dramatically, a biological intervention that limited the lifespan of the human genome itself. Why would the Anunnaki, if they were resource managers, suddenly leave or reduce their oversight? The answer, according to the deeply layered texts, is tied to their own needs and cycles. They were the original city builders, establishing centers like Eridu and Nippur, not necessarily as homes for humanity, but as bases of operation, perhaps linked to mineral extraction or specific energetic requirements. If they were truly the observers, operating on a massive orbital timeline, then the historical record we possess is merely a logbook of their long-duration experiment. They introduced kingship, astronomy, writing, and the necessity of organized urban life. The unsettling thought is that our entire civilization might be an inherited structure, a mechanism left running, rather than an organic, bottom-up evolutionary process. The gaps in the record, the inheritance of silence, are just as telling as the clay tablets themselves. Why did later Mesopotamian empires, eager to claim descent from glorious ancestors, fail to fully embrace the terrifying scale of the pre-Diluvian kings? It suggests a deliberate historical culling, a selective amnesia imposed perhaps by those who inherited the power structure, but did not possess the original, non-mortal mandate. The knowledge of the oldest kings was too potent, too revealing of humanity's secondary role in the grand scheme. But the silence is never total. Embedded within the narratives of these long reigns is a pervasive thread of cyclical return, the return signal. If their presence was governed by astronomical mechanics, then the potential for their reappearance is mathematically predictable. The king list becomes a time capsule, a warning coded in impossibly large numbers, anticipating the moment when the celestial clock strikes the hour of their return. What does it mean for modern civilization to stand, perhaps unknowingly, at the end of one of those immensely long cycles? It demands that we look at the ruins of ancient Babylon, at the precision of the ziggurats, and at the deeply complex astronomical calculations they possessed, not as artifacts of superstitious reverence, but as markers left by meticulous, long-term engineers. They were expecting to come back. If you have stayed with this journey, resisting the urge to dismiss these ideas as mere fringe theory, if you recognize the profound anomaly presented by the intersection of verifiable history and unimaginable duration, then you are a fellow traveler on this path of deep inquiry. It is this shared pursuit of the hidden truth that powers the effort to decode this immense, unsettling timeline. We must continue to ask, what was the true mechanism of the descent? And what did those ancient kings actually administer during their endless, silent reigns? This recognition, that history itself is a palimpsest written over a deeper, non-human story, is the threshold we now cross. The journey into the timeline of the ancient kings is relentless, demanding constant vigilance against easy answers. If the scale of the pre-deluge reigns has genuinely shifted your perception of human history, then show your support for this investigation. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss the upcoming installments where we examine the genetic clues and the physical evidence of these long-vanished administrations. Please like this video, and if you wish to signal your profound engagement with this narrative, take a moment now and comment with the simple evocative phrase, "The echo persists." Join us in the next chapter, which should appear on your screen now, as we delve deeper into the physical evidence left by those who ruled when the millennia were merely moments. What if the most essential truths of our past are not merely lost to time, but consciously obscured by the very structure of time we inherited? We have spent time pondering the impossibilities etched into the Sumerian king list, those staggering numbers that defy human biological limits, the reigns that stretched across 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years. This is not just a statistical anomaly. It is a fundamental collision between conventional historical chronology and an entirely alien temporal framework. The sheer scale of these durations induces a deep intellectual vertigo, forcing us to recognize that the scribes of Sumer were recording something far beyond terrestrial kingship. They were establishing a chronology of presence, a measure of influence defined by entities whose own cycles of existence dwarfed the human experience. If the Anunnaki were indeed the architects, the initial observers, their concept of governance would necessarily align with the vast, slow turning of celestial mechanisms, not the flickering candle of a mortal life. The strangeness intensifies when we consider that these lists are often presented alongside conventional historical records of later, recognized human kings. This juxtaposition is jarring, placing the ephemeral, short reigns of historical rulers directly against the mythological, near-eternal spans of their predecessors. It is the placement of two different realities on the same clay tablet, suggesting that, for the Sumerians, there was no sharp distinction between the before and the after. This recognition pulls us toward a challenging hypothesis, that the immense reigns were not metaphorical exaggerations, but accurate reflections of the periods required to establish and maintain a complex civilization by non-mortal beings who only visited or governed directly during specific astronomical conjunctions, those great cycles known perhaps as the SAR. If we acknowledge the reigns of thousands of years, we are no longer looking at human history. We are mapping the cycles of the great observers. The disquiet begins when we realize that our current, comfortable historical narrative demands we dismiss this entire initial era, the time before the flood, as purely mythical to maintain the coherence of our established timeline. But what if that dismissal is the very mechanism of the engineered amnesia? What if the longevity of the ancient kings was merely a reflection of the distance between their homeworld, or their observational post, and the Earth? The reigns measure not the life of a ruler, but the duration of their direct physical presence on the planet, coordinating the massive projects and genetic manipulations we associate with the early epochs. We are entering deep territory now, where conventional archaeology offers silence and speculation must fill the void. This journey into the ancient timelines requires patience and close attention to the details we unearth. If you find this exploration challenging your deepest historical assumptions, I invite you to pause and reflect on the material. Liking this video helps ensure these questions reach others who are also ready to look beyond the accepted narrative. And sharing your initial impressions in the comments can help us collectively map this difficult terrain. The cyclical nature of Sumerian cosmology, always focused on the heavens, reinforces this framework. Unlike the linear chronologies that dominate Western thought, the ancient world understood time as a series of returns, a continuous repetition dictated by celestial mechanics. The immense length of the Anunnaki-aligned reigns suggests that their governance was structured around the great astronomical cycles that dictate the proximity and visibility of their home planet, the fabled Nibiru. These kings were merely the temporal markers of these greater returns, governing on Earth until the cycle completed and the period of direct intervention passed. This leads us to the heart of the enigma, the recognition that the infrastructure required to support these initial civilizations, the megalithic structures, the highly advanced astronomical knowledge, the sudden bloom of complex language and agriculture, demanded not only advanced technology but also a governance system capable of maintaining a single plan across hundreds of generations of mortal men. A 40,000-year reign means that the king who started the project saw its completion, and likely its decay and eventual overhaul. This eliminates the fatal human flaw of constantly shifting priorities, allowing for construction and engineering on a truly planetary scale. The subsequent uneasiness comes from realizing that if they did govern this way, the remnants of their infrastructure must still be scattered across the globe, misidentified as merely lost civilizations. We begin to see the world not as a collection of random, emerging cultures, but as a vast, meticulously planned experiment, temporarily supervised by beings who operated on a geological timescale. These initial kings, these observers, were the living embodiments of an almost unimaginable temporal continuity. Their descent, often described in texts as coming down from heaven, marks the beginning of the recorded long reigns. Their eventual removal or withdrawal corresponds to the great cataclysm, the flood, which serves as a clean, traumatic break in the historical record, marking the transition from the era of direct governance to the era of human proxies. The weight of the pre-flood infrastructure cannot be overstated. If a king reigns for 36,000 years, the decisions made during his first millennium would still be impacting the world at the time of his eventual departure. Think of the Great Pyramids or Baalbek, structures whose origins defy our ability to date them conventionally. Are these perhaps the remnants of projects initiated by those long-reigning kings, designed to last until the next astronomical return? This line of inquiry turns archaeology on its head, suggesting that we are not digging up ruins. We are uncovering massive inert time capsules left behind by the initial architects. The gradual revelation here is that the Anunnaki timeline isn't merely an alternative history. It is a mechanism for understanding deep time and celestial influence on Earth. Their long reigns were essentially maintenance periods during specific alignments. When those alignments shifted, their presence became less frequent or direct, leading to the establishment of human proxy rulers, the mortal kings whose reigns post-flood suddenly conform to the 3, 10, or 30 years we understand today. The shift in duration is not evolution, it is substitution. This substitution introduced a profound disconnect. The mortal proxies inherited the form of kingship, the scepters, the crowns, the high seats, but not the generational memory or the technological understanding of their predecessors. They inherited the management of systems they did not design and whose purpose they only vaguely comprehended. This leads us to the psychological state of the early post-flood civilizations, a deep reverence mixed with a fundamental confusion. They were building new societies in the shadow of giants, attempting to replicate the wonders of the time before the deluge, using only fragmented instructions. The inherent risk of this substitution was the engineered erasure, the intentional or accidental forgetting of the true nature of the Anunnaki intervention. As generations passed, the memory of the immense reigns hardened into myth. The 40,000-year ruler became a god. The technological feats became magic. This seed of forgetfulness was perhaps the most crucial element in establishing human dominion, ensuring that the new, fragile mortal civilizations would not constantly strive for the unreachable status of their predecessors, thus ensuring the stability of the proxy system. But the price of this stability was our collective ignorance regarding our true origins and the full depth of the ancient timelines. We must consider the possibility that the very structure of our modern historical scholarship, which insists on rigid boundaries between myth and verifiable fact, is merely a continuation of this initial forgetfulness. By separating the immense reigns into the realm of fantasy, we protect ourselves from the profound truth that history, as we know it, began only after the true architects departed. The Anunnaki timeline, therefore, is not about finding obscure dates. It is about finding the boundaries of human history within a much larger cosmic narrative. The investigation compels us to look again at those early, baffling inscriptions. Why were they so meticulous in recording these numbers if they were purely symbolic? The answer, perhaps, is that these records serve as a silent signal, waiting for an age when humanity would develop the intellectual curiosity and the necessary astronomical knowledge to decode their true meaning. They are maps of a grand celestial clock left behind by those who observed, those who governed, and those who eventually withdrew, promising a return. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive into the cycles and the silence between the epochs, you understand the complexity of the questions we are confronting. This information is challenging to process, and your involvement is essential. If you feel the weight of this hidden history, if you sense the presence of these ancient observers in the shadows of our recorded past, let us continue this investigation together. Do not allow this revelation to simply pass you by. If you truly wish to comprehend the full scope of the ancient kings, long reigns, and the Anunnaki timeline, ensure you subscribe to the channel, like this video to keep the discussion prominent, and comment below using the phrase, "The Architects of Oblivion." This helps us measure the true depth of engagement with these profound, often suppressed historical narratives. The next stage of our investigation will focus on the specific astronomical evidence woven into the very fabric of Sumerian civilization, charting the calculated returns of the ancient ones. The veil is thinning, and the shadow of the great cycle is about to fall across our timeline once more. Join us in the next part as we search for the specific celestial signal left behind by the Anunnaki. Where does history truly begin, and where does myth gracefully recede into the shadows? It is a subtle, unsettling question that hangs over the very bedrock of civilization. particularly when examining the archaic strata of the Sumerian king list. We have charted the astronomical epochs, the reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, a profound and undeniable challenge to our modern conception of linear time. But perhaps the most jarring moment in this ancient manuscript is not the sheer duration of those early kings, but the abrupt, violent fracture that cleaves the list precisely in two. The deluge, the great flood, the ultimate reset button pressed by the divine. Before that catastrophe, we are dealing with reigns measured in SARS, units of 3,600 years. The numbers themselves are less a chronological measurement and more a description of proximity to eternity, a kinship with beings whose lifespan was measured against the orbiting clockwork of the cosmos. These were kings who ruled when the kingship descended from heaven. They were intermediaries, perhaps, or direct descendants, maintaining a genetic or technological purity that granted them longevity beyond our comprehension. Yet, when the waters finally receded and the kingship descended from heaven again, this time landing in Kish, the paradigm had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. The reigns are still long, unnervingly so, but they are suddenly terrestrial. We move from 43,200 years to 1,200, then 960, and eventually to the historical verifiable reigns that lasted decades. This transition is not smooth. It is a mathematical stutter, a profound recognition that something massive, a curtain drawn across the stage of history, had occurred. If the pre-Diluvian kings were the original guardians, the immediate post-Diluvian rulers, like Etana, the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all lands, or the early dynasts of Uruk, represent a perplexing middle ground. They lived for hundreds of years, an impossible span by current human standards, but they are fundamentally shorter-lived than their predecessors. This implies a dilution, a genetic fading, or perhaps the withdrawal of the direct technological support system. We must ask, who governed this transition? Who set the new, albeit still elongated, lifespan parameters? These new dynasts, though still possessing miraculous longevity, were suddenly operating within a different framework, governed by a different, less lenient calendar. They appear to be the crucial link, the human inheritors of the non-human legacy, the students trying to reconstruct the lessons taught by the vanished or retreating masters. This sudden shortening of the reigns is the first great sign of our historical alienation, the moment when the Anunnaki timeline begins its slow, deliberate merge with the timeline we are taught in school, and it makes the entire document feel less like a myth and more like a precise, if cryptic, historical ledger detailing an experimental phase of civilization. Understanding this dramatic shift requires us to look not merely at the numbers, but at the purpose behind the chronology. The sheer weight of those thousands of years, both before and immediately after the flood, demands reflection. It is in this contemplative space, wrestling with the implications of deep time, that we begin to perceive the architecture of the ancient world not as accidental evolution, but as a deliberate structure established, maintained, and occasionally adjusted. If the concept of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, is integrated into this timeline, then the Sumerian king list is their operational log, detailing their active governance, their initial withdrawal, and the subsequent phases of indirect observation. We are now standing at the precipice of understanding, recognizing the inherent strangeness of the historical narrative. If you find yourself nodding, tracing the lines between the astronomical and the terrestrial, feeling the magnetic pull of this lost history, then you are part of this continuing investigation. We encourage you to reflect deeply on this specific transition, the mathematical gulf between the antediluvian and post-diluvian reigns, and share your thoughts on what this drastic shift truly signifies in the comments below. What does this reduction in lifespan tell us about the changing relationship between the divine observers and the emerging human civilization? This is not just a study of history. It is a collaborative effort to decipher the signal buried beneath the sediment of millennia. If this journey of recognition resonates, please consider subscribing and liking this video, allowing us to continue peeling back the layers of these profound mysteries. The inheritors of the post-Diluvian kingship still held keys to technologies, knowledge, and perhaps even biological markers that differentiated them fundamentally from the common populace. Consider the weight of Eridu, the first city listed, the home of Enki. Even after the catastrophe, the foundational knowledge of engineering, agriculture, and astronomy, the Me, The divine decrees that govern civilization must have survived, passed down to the first ruling dynasties. These post-flood kings, ruling for hundreds of years, were not necessarily still direct participants in the cosmic timeline, but they were the custodians of its memory. They were the ones tasked with establishing order in the chaotic world, utilizing the remaining tools and perhaps receiving periodic, though less direct instruction from the retreating observers. The sheer administrative complexity of rebuilding after a global cataclysm, a task that requires perfect planning, resource allocation, and advanced knowledge, reinforces the idea that the first post-flood settlements were not rudimentary villages, but highly structured urban centers, designed and initiated by advanced intelligence. The question of why the reigns shortened, even if still impossibly long, takes us into the realm of cycles and cosmic resonance. Did the original Anunnaki timeline rely on a specific planetary alignment or orbital cycle, perhaps the return of Nibiru, to sustain their influence or even their own biological requirements on Earth? The Great Flood itself is tied to cataclysmic astronomical events. If their presence or ability to intervene directly was dependent on these massive cycles of return, then the period immediately following the flood represents a time of diminished capacity, perhaps a long, slow wait for the next optimal alignment. The long post-flood reigns, therefore, might be the result of a carefully controlled maintenance program, ensuring the stability of their human proxies until the time of the next great observation or intervention. The maintenance of the Sumerian king list itself, a document so diligently preserved and copied by succeeding empires like Babylon and Assyria, speaks volumes. These later cultures were not simply recording quaint myths. They were preserving a sacred lineage, a foundational charter that legitimized their own connection to the genesis of kingship. This suggests that the deep time recorded in the tablets was understood not as fanciful exaggeration, but as genuine history, albeit a history defined by powers far greater than humanity. The kings of Babylon sought to establish their own short, historical reigns as the direct, unbroken continuation of the divine succession that began in Eridu. They were consciously tapping into the energy, the authority, and the terrible power of the long-reigning observers. This persistence of the record is a powerful signal of an inherited truth, a memory encoded in clay that refused to be forgotten, even as the specific nature of the Anunnaki faded into religious syncretism and allegory. We find ourselves constantly confronted by the specter of the Watchers, the Igigi, or those segments of the Anunnaki who may have remained closer to the human sphere, overseeing the development of civilization after the flood. It is an uncomfortable thought that the earliest forms of human governance were essentially stewardship, a temporary lease granted by non-human intelligence. The hundreds of years of rule enjoyed by early dynasts might simply represent the lifespan of the first generation of genetically modified or indoctrinated human proxies, individuals optimized to carry out complex directives and manage global affairs, until true, short-lived human civilization was robust enough to stand on its own, however flawed that independence might prove to be. The lingering longevity is the signature of their artificial distinction, the last fading echo of the genetic inheritance before it was finally diluted beyond recognition. This journey demands attention to detail, a quiet persistence in connecting the dots across millennia. If these concepts resonate with you, if you feel the deep hum of hidden history, we encourage you to pause and internalize this segment. This is history requiring meditative engagement. Share your thoughts below, perhaps using the phrase, "the inheritance of Eridu," to mark your place in this investigation. The timeline presented by these ancient texts is less a set of dates and more a gradual, deliberate withdrawal of observation, a slow severance of the umbilical cord connecting the first civilizations to their non-human creators. The subsequent shortening of the reigns, eventually settling into the familiar pattern of human mortality, is the true beginning of our historical amnesia. It is the point where the direct, verifiable evidence of the observers fades, forcing the history of the Anunnaki into the realm of myth, where it was deliberately sequestered and protected from later scrutiny. But the architectural foundations remain. The sudden appearance of advanced cities, complex writing, astronomical knowledge, and the concept of divine kingship. All of these elements appeared simultaneously, fully formed, precisely when the ancient kings listed in the SKL were establishing order after the flood. This is the ultimate paradox. The reigns become shorter, but the output of civilization becomes exponentially greater and more complex, suggesting that the initial period of long-reign governance was less about active human development and more about the implementation of a pre-established plan. To arrive at this point in the investigation, Part 4 of 8, is to acknowledge that you are moving beyond mainstream skepticism and into a deeper inquiry. You recognize the weight of the evidence, the calculated strangeness of the long reigns, and the implicit narrative of external influence woven into the deepest memories of Sumer. We are navigating a chronology designed by those who measured time not in decades, but in cycles that encompass the rise and fall of worlds. If you have stayed with us through this dense examination, tracing the mathematical descent from the divine to the temporal, you are essential to this inquiry. We have followed the kingship from heaven, through the abyss of the flood, and into the initial, still impossibly long, human reigns. The next steps will require us to analyze the signals they left behind, the structures, the texts, and the prophecies that hint at their ultimate return. If this search for the foundational truth resonates with you, do not let the momentum fade. We ask that you join our community of deep thinkers and investigators by subscribing to the channel. Please give this video a like to signal your engagement with the core themes, and leave a comment below with the specific phrase, "The signal persists," as proof you reached this crucial juncture. The journey continues, and in our next part, we will turn our focus to the physical evidence, the ruins and the celestial maps, that validate the cyclical nature of the Anunnaki timeline. Click on the next video appearing on your screen now to continue this deep historical dive. Is it possible that the deepest truths about our origins are not hidden in grand monuments or encoded in complex mathematics, but simply recorded plainly, yet impossibly, on clay tablets, records that we, in our modern hubris, dismiss as mere flights of primitive fancy? We have walked through the initial chambers of this colossal structure of forgotten history, examining the Sumerian king list, where the reigns of monarchs before the deluge stretch across periods that defy biological and chronological comprehension. 43,000 years, 28,000 years, reigns so vast they render our entire documented history an ephemeral footnote. The conventional archaeologist files this under mythopoeic narrative, suggesting these numbers represent nothing more than symbolic representations of cultural continuity or astrological observation. Yet, the palpable dissonance remains. Why would a society capable of establishing complex administrative and legal codes, capable of mapping the visible heavens with astonishing accuracy, suddenly resort to recording utter biological fiction? The meticulousness of the scribes, the careful ordering of these names and their corresponding cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, suggests a gravity we routinely ignore. We are witnessing not just a list of kings, but perhaps a chronology of management cycles. What if the king was not an individual man, but an assigned administrator, a temporary terrestrial steward representing an external authority whose own lifespan, or perception of time, was fundamentally different from ours? The unease deepens when we recognize how the king list abruptly pivots. Following the catastrophic event known as the Great Flood, the reigns become violently, jarringly short. We shift from millennia to decades, from the immortal to the painfully mortal. This bifurcation, the pre-Diluvian age of the long reigns and the post-Diluvian age of human brevity, is not unique to Mesopotamia. It echoes, with haunting symmetry, through the myths of nearly every ancient culture, from the Hindu Puranas to the biblical accounts of the patriarchs. The deluge served not just as a global reset button, wiping clean the physical landscape, but perhaps as a chronological marker, establishing a new operational tempo for governance on Earth. It suggests that the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven, had a specific objective tied to the existence of a pristine, or at least highly regulated environment. When that environment was destroyed, their direct involvement and the need for these enormously long managerial cycles diminished or shifted entirely. The question we must address now is not merely how they lived so long, but why they needed to govern for those vast stretches of time and what specific resources or processes they were overseeing. To truly grasp the scope of this investigation, One must be willing to sit with the ambiguity, to allow the impossible data points to guide the inquiry rather than dismiss them. This journey requires intellectual patience and profound curiosity. If you find yourself leaning forward, feeling this peculiar weight of forgotten history pressing against the present moment, I encourage you to pause for a moment of reflection. Share your initial thoughts in the comments below. Let us know which forgotten piece of the historical puzzle you believe holds the key to the long reigns. Your participation is an essential part of decoding this mystery. Also, consider subscribing and liking this video as we continue to venture into territory too often ignored by mainstream history. Act 3. Recognition of cycles. The key to understanding these long cycles lies perhaps in the Sumerian concept of the me, those fundamental and divine decrees or forces that governed every aspect of civilization, from metallurgy to kingship, justice to temple building. These MEs were guarded, controlled, and dispensed by the primary Anunnaki figures, notably Enlil and Enki. These were not abstract ideas. They were the technological or intellectual blueprint for civilization itself. If the Anunnaki governance structure relied on the cyclical application and management of these MEs, perhaps tied to astronomical alignment or the orbital mechanics of their own celestial body, the famed planet that Sitchin posited, Nibiru, then the necessity for extraordinarily long, stable reigns becomes clear. They were managing Earth according to a cosmic choreography, a schedule dictated by the stars and the return of a specific astronomical signal. If a full management cycle corresponded to a great year or a portion thereof, periods spanning thousands of our terrestrial years, then the local administrator, the pre-Diluvian king, had to be capable of maintaining that continuity. They were the terrestrial node in an immensely complex, slow-moving interplanetary network. Act 4. The unease of predetermination. This recognition brings with it an inherent disquiet. If the reigns were predetermined by external astronomical cycles, then the concept of human free will, or even the trajectory of early civilization, may have been far more rigidly defined than we care to admit. We cherish the idea of history as a series of unpredictable human choices and chaotic accidents. But the king list, with its mathematical precision and cyclical structure, suggests an almost mechanical unfolding, a cosmic clock ticking down according to rules set by the extraterrestrial observers. The long reigns thus become markers not of biological life but of waiting periods, periods required for celestial bodies to reach a necessary alignment, for resources to accumulate, or for specific biological experimentation to reach fruition. The sheer scale of time involved forces us to reassess the very definition of rule or kingship. Were these long-lived administrators true sovereigns, or simply caretakers meticulously following a pre-written millennia-spanning script? Act 5. Shepherds versus creators. The subtle shift in perspective here is crucial. We move from viewing the Anunnaki solely as creators, the genetic engineers who fashioned Homo sapiens, to recognizing them as shepherds, or perhaps more accurately, high-level resource managers. They established the initial conditions, the creation of the Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker, implemented the necessary infrastructure, the first cities, the Eden, and then put the process on an extremely long maintenance cycle. The long reigns represent the fidelity of the system during this prolonged absentee management. They weren't necessarily present on Earth constantly, but their authority, vested in those long-reigning kings, remained absolute, tied to their periodic oversight or return. When the system was fundamentally disrupted by the deluge, the parameters changed, necessitating a change in the management structure. The post-flood era introduced shorter reigns because the Anunnaki either delegated authority more broadly or required more frequent replacement cycles, perhaps because the newly optimized human worker was now fertile and stable enough to manage local affairs without needing a semi-divine intermediary for 40,000 years. Act 6. The true nature of delegated authority. The reigns, therefore, represent cycles of delegated authority. Consider the logistics. If a high-level entity requires mineral resources, let us say gold, extracted over a 100,000-year period, it would be inefficient to establish a new governing structure every 50 years. A single consistent administrator, or a lineage of administrators tied to the original mandate by powerful genetic or technological means, provides the stability required for the long-term, slow-burn objective. This explains the specific focus of the king list on continuity, the transferring of kingship from one city to the next after the deluge. It's not just a historical accounting, it's an operational manual tracking the movement of the administrative center, the central command post for the resource extraction program, all under the distant, watchful gaze of the supreme authorities. To comment on this section, tell us one thing you think the Anunnaki were truly managing. Was it gold, humanity's genetic code, or something else entirely? Act 7. The function of the Eden. The Eden, the land between the two rivers, often equated with the Garden of Eden, takes on a new significance in this light. It was not merely a fertile paradise. It was the designated operational zone, the control center for the management cycles. The technology, the MEs, the administrative structures, and the communication links to the orbiting or distant mothership were concentrated here. The very act of establishing the first cities, Eridu, the home of Enki, was an act of establishing high-density, centralized control. The long reigns were anchored to these centers, ensuring the fidelity of the mission. When the flood destroyed this meticulously established infrastructure, the observers were forced to adapt, moving their centers of power, the kingship, to new, less optimal locations, leading to a scattering of influence and the gradual devolution of the direct control that characterized the pre-Diluvian period. Act 8. Globalizing the narrative, the observers. If this system of long-cycle management was implemented in Sumer, we must ask if it was localized or global. Expanding our view, we see echoes of extraordinarily long-lived or divine rulers in the annals of pre-dynastic Egypt, particularly the enigmatic period of the followers of Horus, the Shemsu-Hor. These beings, often depicted as semi-divine, bridged the gap between the chaotic mythical era and the first human pharaohs. They governed for similarly impossible periods. This suggests a unified global strategy of oversight, where the Anunnaki influence was not confined to Mesopotamia, but extended to key operational areas across the planet. The long reigns in Sumerian clay become evidence of an early planetary cartel, a coordinated management system designed to optimize the slow, deliberate work of whatever mission these observers were here to complete. They were establishing an architecture of control that would survive their temporary absence. Act 9. The signal of forgetfulness. But why the massive historical gap? Why, if these truths were so meticulously recorded, did they become relegated to myth? Here we introduce the concept of the signal of forgetfulness. Perhaps when the primary observers departed, or when their governing cycle ended after the deluge, a form of intellectual or technological degradation was implemented, whether intentional or accidental. The very knowledge that sustained the long reigns, the understanding of the MEs, the celestial calendar, the true nature of the gods, was gradually lost to the shorter-lived human generations. The kings who followed, post-deluge, inherited the title and the city, but not the deep cosmic comprehension of their predecessors. The memory faded, turning administration into ritual, science into religion, and history into confused mythology. The length of the reigns became the hardest truth to swallow, thus becoming the first to be categorized as fantasy, pushing the true history of the observers into the shadows. Act 10. Setting the stage for return. This brings us back to the unsettling implication. If the long reigns were synchronized with astronomical cycles, then the cessation of those cycles and the subsequent forgetfulness might only be temporary. We are left contemplating the ultimate purpose of this deep history, this colossal record carved onto brittle clay. Was it merely a historical ledger for human benefit, or was it a breadcrumb trail, a celestial time capsule awaiting the fulfillment of the next grand cycle? The Anunnaki timeline, etched in impossible numbers, suggests a deep-seated patience, an understanding of time far beyond our grasp, and an expectation of return. The question is no longer whether they were here, or even how long they reigned, but what specific signal, what celestial alignment, is currently being measured on the cosmic scale that might indicate the activation of the next phase of their long-term plan. This sets the stage for our next investigation, focusing on the astronomical indicators and the prophesied return. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive into the cycles of governance and the shadow history of the Anunnaki timeline, it means you recognize the crucial nature of these patterns. You are one of the few willing to confront the magnitude of what the Sumerian scribes left behind. If you are serious about continuing this investigation and uncovering the truth behind these ancient kings and their celestial observers, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel. Hitting the like button helps others who seek this knowledge find their way here. And to mark your commitment to uncovering the signal of forgetfulness, comment below with the exact phrase, "The cycle must continue." Join us immediately in the next part of this series, which should be appearing on your screen now, as we dissect the astronomical evidence pointing toward the prophesied return of the observers. What if the longest shadows cast across human history are not those of conventional empires, but the remnants of a time we were never meant to fully remember? We have spent considerable time examining the king list, that startling artifact of Sumer, detailing reigns of such impossible length that they defy all known laws of biology and temporal measurement. But staring at those massive figures, the 28,000 years, the 36,000 years, we must transition from merely acknowledging the paradox to understanding the mechanism behind it. This isn't just about ancient hyperbole. It is about recognizing a specific residual frequency in the historical record, a lingering trace of something profoundly other. The reigns are not simply long, they are markers of epochs defined by an entirely different biological and political framework. We are looking at a history written under the influence of visitors whose lifespans were measured against celestial mechanics, not terrestrial calendars. The immediate cognitive dissonance arises because we attempt to fit this monumental scale into our own context of scarcity and mortality. Yet if we accept, even tentatively, the existence of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, then the longevity becomes less a miracle and more a biological norm for an advanced species, operating on a cyclical time frame entirely alien to ours. What remains unclear, and what forces us into the realm of true historical unease, is how such hyperlongevity interacted with the nascent human civilization they were supposedly cultivating. Did the ancient kings, in their seemingly unending terms, view the generations of their human subjects as we view the blooming and fading of a brief summer flower? This perspective, if true, fundamentally changes the dynamic of early civilization, transforming the rulers from mere monarchs into something akin to high-level stewards, overseeing millennia-long projects with patient, non-human foresight. The sheer length of their rule implies a stability, a mastery over the environment, and perhaps even a control over the biological clock of their immediate descendants that modern science can only dream of. It speaks to a heritage, a genetic blueprint perhaps, that was momentarily imposed upon our timeline before a great systemic shift occurred. This systematic residue of forgotten cycles is precisely where the historical narrative begins to feel stretched, thin, and dangerously close to snapping. If these reigns were dictated by an astronomical clockwork, specifically the grand orbital return of their alleged homeworld, Nibiru, a period spanning thousands of years, then every major event recorded in the cuneiform tablets, from the establishment of Eridu to the Great Flood, ceases to be random historical occurrence and becomes a meticulously scheduled entry on a cosmological ledger. The kings ruled until the signal was given, until the alignment was complete, until the celestial coordinates demanded a change in management. The paradox of this hyperlongevity also forces us to consider the concept of genetic obsolescence. If the original Anunnaki rulers possessed lifespans measured in eons, then their human proxies, the half-breeds or the specially elevated human governors, must have represented an accelerated decay in temporal authority. The abrupt shortening of the kingly reigns after the Great Flood, plummeting from tens of thousands to hundreds, and finally to the mortal constraints we recognize today, suggests a calculated withdrawal of genetic or technological support. It is the narrative of a gradual delegation of power, where the immediate, high-purity heritage faded as the cosmic distance between the observers and the observed widened. The kings ceased being nearly immortal when the primary controllers decided their continuous physical presence was no longer required for the functioning of the terrestrial experiment. The question is, did they leave behind a failsafe, a mechanism for their return? If this journey into the deep time of Sumer and the Anunnaki timeline compels you to look at the foundations of history in a new light, then you are engaging with the material exactly as intended. This level of investigation requires time, reflection, and the willingness to question deep-seated assumptions. Take a moment now to secure your place in this conversation by subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Tell me, What specific ancient artifact or kingly name resonates most strongly with the idea of a pre-human stewardship? Your insights fuel this continuous investigation, ensuring we do not overlook the subtle clues left behind by these ancient observers. We recognize the astronomical clockwork as the true engine of this timeline. The Mesopotamian chroniclers, often interpreted as chronicling local dynastic squabbles, might have been inadvertently recording complex orbital mechanics. The return of the celestial body, or the passing of a critical perihelion point, acted as the official period marker for the Anunnaki. When the heavenly boat appeared in the skies, it was time for regime change, for the transfer of the divine me, the laws of civilization and technology, to the next chosen proxy. This recognition elevates the Sumerian echoes beyond mere mythology. They become geopolitical reports filtered through the available spiritual lexicon of the time. The Great Cataclysm, the Flood, is not merely a biblical event. It is the most significant marker on the Anunnaki timeline, the point of historical and genetic demarcation. It's the moment the primary administrators made a decision to reset the experiment, perhaps due to uncontrolled variables, or perhaps because the cyclical proximity of Nibiru demanded a temporary or permanent withdrawal from the immediate surface. The unease stems from the realization that this shifting of the guardianship was not a voluntary retirement but a structured handover, leaving Earth under the surveillance of those who were designated to maintain the ancient heritage until the appointed return. Cuneiform texts often describe the bestowal of knowledge, the giving of the tablets of destiny, or the blueprints for temple construction. This suggests a careful preservation of technological knowledge that, if improperly accessed or deployed, could destroy the fledgling human civilization. These kings, these early human stewards, were essentially holding the keys to a vast cosmic library, tasked with keeping the knowledge intact and dormant until the benefactors, or perhaps the original architects, signaled their intent to reappear. The longevity, post-flood, shrinks precisely because the immediate, high-level administrative functions were no longer needed. The focus shifted from active rule to passive preservation. It leads us to an unsettling reversal, the point where the observers became the observed. If the Anunnaki withdrew physically but left behind a comprehensive informational legacy, be it through ritual, architecture, or genetic programming, then human history, since the flood, has potentially unfolded under the lens of subtle, periodic inspection. Our entire civilization, from the rise of great philosophical schools to the current technological singularity, could be merely a long-term data collection project, managed by a select few descendants or unseen technological apparatuses left behind. We are the subjects in the lab, and the kings of long ago were merely the first batch of lab assistants, reporting back on the progress of the terrestrial species. The sheer weight of the Mesopotamian archives, the density of their astronomical, mathematical, and historical records, takes on a new gravity under this lens. Why such meticulous record-keeping, often detailing events that seem irrelevant to immediate survival? Because these archives were not meant for immediate human consumption. They were the historical ledgers intended for the eventual inspection of the returning progenitors. They are time capsules detailing the operational parameters of a terrestrial colony, carefully maintained by the designated human lineage. The epic sagas detailing interactions with the gods, their arguments, their alliances, their interventions, are not just colorful stories. They are crucial political documents chronicling the inner workings of an off-world management team dealing with internal strife and resource allocation on a remote planet. Decoding the symbolic language of the descent and ascent becomes critical here. When the texts speak of the gods descending to Sumer, they are not describing a generalized theological concept. They are describing a landing, a physical manifestation linked to specific astronomical phenomena. Conversely, the ascent, or the turning away, is the withdrawal, the calculated departure correlated with the planet's orbital recession. This continuous pattern suggests a planned schedule of interaction, not a capricious interference. The gradual revelation, therefore, is this: the history of ancient kings and long reigns is merely the operational manual for a colony that was subject to cyclical, interplanetary management. The ancient kings were the necessary bridge between two worlds, the custodians of a secret knowledge whose very existence was tied to the appearance of a specific celestial body. The profound implications for modern chronology are destabilizing. If the true markers of our deep past are astronomical cycles rather than conventional radiocarbon dating, then large swathes of our established timeline might represent missing time, periods when the Anunnaki were present and active, governing using non-terrestrial timelines, which we have since collapsed into mythological noise because our standard historical instruments cannot account for reigns of 20,000 years. Our current understanding of the Bronze Age, the Neolithic Revolution, and the origins of agriculture might be severely truncated, failing to acknowledge the long periods of guided development under hyper-long-lived authorities. The transition out of the mythical reigns into historically verifiable shorter reigns is the final act of the Anunnaki timeline, the moment they truly stepped back, leaving us to fend for ourselves, reliant only on the carefully curated technological heritage they bestowed. This structured withdrawal brings us back to the present with profound inquietude, the unspoken promise of the next alignment. If the entire Anunnaki timeline is based on cycles, then the possibility of a return, a revisitation scheduled by those same cosmic mechanics, remains the enduring silent question mark looming over our modern world. Have we, as the inheritors of this experimental planet, developed enough autonomy, enough wisdom, to manage the heritage they left us? Or have we merely created a global civilization that is ripe for re-evaluation by the original architects when the astronomical clock finally signals the completion of the long orbital journey? The texts offer little comfort, suggesting that their returns are often tied to great transformative periods, potentially cataclysmic in nature. If you have stayed with this narrative, navigating the deep waters of ancient chronology and extraterrestrial stewardship, you understand the magnitude of what we are uncovering. If the concept of long reigns as chronological markers, dictated by celestial orbits, resonates deeply with your search for truth, I urge you to join this dedicated community. Subscribe to the channel now, if you haven't already, and hit the like button to signal that this profound investigation should continue. For those who seek the deepest understanding, tell me in the comments, using the exact phrase, "The signal is the cycle." This is the heart of the matter, and your commitment to this phrase shows that you recognize the profound link between the longest reigns and the cosmic imperative. Do not leave the narrative here. The conclusion of this ancient covenant awaits our scrutiny in the next part of this investigation, which you can continue watching right now. Is it possible that history is not defined by what we remember, but by what we were systematically encouraged to forget? We have traveled through the impossibly elongated reigns of the ancient kings, periods measured not in generations, but in millennia, forcing us to confront a timeline that defies human biology and conventional archaeology. Yet the deepest riddle is not the duration of these reigns, but the stark, unaccountable silence that often followed them. We see a glorious, hyper-advanced civilization detailed in the king lists and the cuneiform tablets, a society guided by what they called the Me, the divine decrees. And then, almost overnight, we encounter a historical threshold where these records fade into something recognizably human, fragile, and far less powerful. The sudden shift from epochs spanning 36,000 years to reigns of mere decades creates a cognitive dissonance that historians typically dismiss as mythological hyperbole. But what if that hyperbole is the only language we have left to describe a reality too vast for our current comprehension of chronology? The core question shifts from how these kings lived so long to why the records insist they did. The immense numbers might not be a measure of biological lifespan, but a measure of celestial cycles, administrative epochs dictated by a clockwork far beyond the terrestrial sphere. When we look deeply into the cosmology of ancient Mesopotamia, we realize their understanding of time was profoundly different from our modern linear progression. For them, time was cyclical, a vast wheel turning through ages marked by the rise and fall of celestial bodies, specifically tied to the precession of the equinoxes. This perspective introduces the unsettling possibility that the long reigns were not arbitrary exaggerations, but precise numerical markers indicating periods when a specific external influence, the Anunnaki, was actively governing, setting up the framework for civilization, and conducting experiments in governance and resource extraction. The long reigns, then, become epochs of direct intervention, spanning the duration of their orbital proximity, or their administrative mandate on Earth. This leads us to the echo of the lost cyclical time. If the kings were not men but proxies, or even biological hybrids designed for long-term stewardship, their timeline would necessarily align with the rhythm of their creators, a rhythm that pulsated according to a cosmic calendar. Our modern struggle is that we try to fit this cosmic rhythm into a 5,000-year linear history, like trying to fit the vast ocean into a teacup. The very concept of time held by these ancients recognized the return, the senile, the moment when the celestial overseers would reappear or retreat, signaling the commencement or termination of a long reign. This cyclical understanding of history implies that the so-called mythological ages are simply previous iterations of the cycle, governed by rules that we have since deliberately or accidentally forgotten. The most profound realization is the recognition of the shadow of the observer. The Sumerian king list is not merely a register. It is a meticulously preserved treaty, a legal document detailing the transfer of power from the divine to the human. When the texts describe kingship descending from heaven, it must be taken literally within their framework. This descent marks the moment when the observers established their presence and began their operational timeline. The immense duration of the first 8 antediluvian kings, totaling 200 years, represents the foundational period of their observation and control, preceding the global flood, a massive environmental reset event. If we accept the possibility that these observers, these Anunnaki, operated on a lifespan or a functional timeline tied to the 3,600-year cycle known as the SAR, suddenly those impossibly long reigns begin to make numerical, if not biological, sense. We are recognizing a pattern, a consistent fingerprint of external manipulation across multiple cultural narratives that share this common theme of divine intervention followed by a great flood. This recognition brings with it the weight of the cosmic calendar. It is no accident that so many ancient myths revolve around celestial alignment and astronomical observation. These were not primitive skywatchers. They were tracking movements critical to the administrative schedule of their divine masters. If the long reigns were keyed to orbital mechanics, the slow, monumental dance of a planet returning to perihelion, then the kings were simply the placeholders, the human face of an off-world administration. This cosmic calendar dictates everything: the establishment of the great cities, the creation of elaborate irrigation systems which served resource gathering, and perhaps most chillingly, the inevitable periods of silence and abandonment, the moments when the observers retreated back into the void, leaving humanity to manage its inherited, albeit heavily modified, civilization until the next synal. The historical gaps we observe, the sudden drops in technological prowess after the reigns of the gods, are simply the periods of operational hiatus. What remains today, scattered across the deserts of the Middle East and buried beneath layers of sediment, is the hidden blueprint. These are not merely ruins. They are instruction manuals, architectural plans, and coded messages left behind for the next iteration of the cycle. The megalithic precision of sites like Baalbek, where stones weighing thousands of tons were moved with apparent ease, speaks to a technology and an understanding of physics far surpassing anything available to the subsequent generations of human kings. These constructions are too robust, too carefully aligned, and too disproportionately massive for the simple purpose of human dwelling. They were designed for longevity, perhaps even for signaling across vast distances, operating as part of the overall Anunnaki infrastructure. The blueprints are hidden in plain sight, encoded in the mathematics of temple construction and the astronomical alignments of ziggurats. To unlock the meaning of the long reigns, we must stop looking at the bricks and start looking at the geometry, the subtle whisper of a superior intellect impressed upon the nascent human world. This raises the crucial question of the inheritance and the forgetfulness. Why did humanity forget this knowledge? Was it a natural decay following the withdrawal of the keepers, or was it a deliberate act of historical erasure, perhaps even a consequence of the mixing of species and the dilution of the original, enhanced human stock? We have inherited a profound, complex legacy, yet we stand at the precipice of understanding, struggling to decode the very foundation of our existence. This deep engagement requires immense mental focus, sifting through the noise of conventional history to find the resonance of truth. If this quest for forgotten knowledge resonates with you, if you feel the weight of this inheritance, I invite you to pause and consider joining this ongoing investigation. by subscribing and engaging with this material, by sharing your own reflections in the comments below. You become an active participant in connecting these fragmented pieces of our deepest past. It is only through collective curiosity and sustained focus that we can hope to retrieve the forgotten science left behind by those long-reigning overseers. Continuing our thread, we focus on the signal in the ruins. The colossal figures reported in the king list serve as the primary signal. If 241,200 years is a measure of their operational time, what does that period represent cosmologically? It hints at an understanding of time that transcends Earth's annual rotation. It suggests a civilization capable of monitoring and navigating immense astronomical distances and durations. The numbers themselves are a code. The sexagesimal system of Sumer is inherently cyclical and mathematically elegant, allowing them to measure both seconds and millennia with equal precision. When we see the number 3,600 recurring in Sumerian units, the SAR, and when we associate that period with the supposed orbital return of Nibiru, the entire timeline of the long reigns snaps into focus. The kings were ruling for 1 SAR, 2 SAR, or multiple SAR cycles, marking out defined epochs of resource collection, genetic manipulation, and technological transfer. The ruins, therefore, are not memorials to the dead, but functional time markers, silently counting down until the next signal. This forces us to ponder the purpose of the return. If the Anunnaki retreated, leaving the keys to the kingdom with semi-divine or appointed rulers, why would they ever need to return? The foundational narrative implies a resource dependency, perhaps gold or other specific elements necessary for their planetary survival. The return, then, is not a mystical visitation, but a scheduled, operational necessity, a return to harvest what was seeded, both literally and figuratively. The long reigns thus serve as the stable administrative periods necessary to ensure that the required resources or intellectual advancements were cultivated and maintained until the parent civilization could dock and collect. The myths that speak of the gods abandoning humanity in frustration or anger may simply be our human interpretation of an organized, systematic withdrawal based on a cosmic clock we no longer understand. This cycle of return and retreat explains the intermittent bursts of profound technological advancement seen in the archaeological record, followed by the regression we mistakenly call the Dark Ages. And so, we re-examine the mandate of heaven re-examined. The Sumerian king list is the prototype for nearly every subsequent concept of divine kingship across the globe, from the Egyptian pharaohs who claimed descent from Ra to the Chinese emperors who ruled under the mandate of heaven. This universal concept, the ruler is legitimate only because they were granted authority directly by celestial beings, suggests a shared global memory of the external administration. It's not a coincidence. It's evidence of a common operating system installed globally during that long reign epoch. The legitimacy of these ancient lines was rooted not in military conquest or popular consent, but in direct lineage to the observers, establishing a strict hierarchy of power designed to maintain the necessary stability for the long-term, cyclical goals of the Anunnaki. Even today, the residual power of monarchy, though largely symbolic, whispers of a time when the king was literally a bridge between heaven and earth. We now stand at the edge of synthesis, staring into the abyss of the final reckoning. The impossibly long reigns are not fairy tales. They are the key to unlocking the true duration of human history and our place within a larger cosmic infrastructure. The kings, the cycles, the sudden floods, and the technological leaps, they all point toward an orchestrated timeline, a narrative managed by observers with vastly superior power and unimaginable longevity. We have processed the strangeness, recognized the pattern, and felt the deep unease of understanding that our historical timeline is only a fraction of the full story. The next step is to synthesize this information, to bring together the evidence of genetic manipulation, astronomical cycles, and architectural impossibilities into a single coherent narrative that explains the fundamental question: what was the grand experiment on Earth, and are we truly alone in observing its outcome? If this journey into the dense tapestry of ancient history, long reigns, and the Anunnaki timeline has captivated your attention, if you have remained focused and absorbed the complexity of this narrative until this precise moment, then you are ready for the final revelations. This is not casual viewing. This is a serious investigation into the foundations of civilization. If you feel compelled to see the ultimate synthesis of these cycles and signals, ensure you are subscribed to the channel. Press the like button to help this profound knowledge reach others who seek the truth hidden within the ruins. And to mark your presence at the culmination of this part of the journey, please comment the phrase, "The cycle continues." Prepare yourself for the final piece of the puzzle, where we tie all these threads together into a single, comprehensive timeline. The next stage of the reckoning awaits you. What if the most profound deception in human history was not a lie of omission, but a lie of scale? What if we are not suffering from a lack of evidence, but from an inability to comprehend the sheer, impossible duration of time that preceded us? We have dedicated 8 extensive explorations to the kingly list of Sumer, studying the baffling anomaly of reigns measured not in decades or centuries, but in astronomical units of 28,800, 36,000, and 43,200 years. We recognize the names, the cities that rose and vanished, and the definitive marker that separates the time before from the time we inhabit, the deluge. But the physical deluge, however catastrophic, hides the philosophical chasm it created. The question that lingers in the silence of the archival halls is this: why did the chroniclers, those who carefully recorded the mundane details of grain silos and tax receipts, choose to preserve these pre-Diluvian figures, knowing they defy all human lifespan parameters, only for mainstream academia to dismiss them as mythological placeholders? This intentional preservation is the key to understanding the ultimate closure of the Anunnaki timeline. The record keepers were not foolish. They were precise. They insisted that the kingship was lowered from heaven, and then, after the waters receded, it was lowered from heaven again. Yet, the second iteration of kingship was tragically short, humanly frail. The first kingship lasted hundreds of thousands of years. The second struggled to survive a single millennium. The difference is the signal. It suggests not a continuity of governance, but a catastrophic change in the nature of reality itself. A fundamental recalibration of chronological scale engineered by forces beyond mortal comprehension. We are left looking through a narrow keyhole at an infinite expanse, and the lingering echo is the sound of those first immensely long reigns, the sound of an operational framework that humanity inherited but did not create. The very architecture of our understanding of history seems designed to make us forget the scale of the pre-deluge epoch. It's a purposeful forgetfulness, a chronological deceit that shrinks the universe down to fit our fleeting lives, ensuring we remain focused on the immediate, the tangible, the now, rather than the vast, cyclical operation that set the stage. Perhaps the very act of seeking to understand these archaic durations is the first step in breaking the intended amnesia. We stand at the precipice of recognition. The initial long reigns were never intended for human comprehension. They were epochs of management, defined by cycles far exceeding the orbit of our sun. To fully grasp this final chapter, we must shed the modern linear perspective of time and adopt the cyclical cosmological view of the Anunnaki themselves. Our history is measured in revolutions around a local star. Their history was measured in the immense orbit of their own star system. In the Great Year, a colossal period of return and observation. The king list serves as a celestial map, charting the intervals between their significant arrivals and departures, where each king's staggering duration was perhaps less about the life of an individual and more about the mandated period of oversight, a defined phase of operation. This shift in perspective turns the impossible into the inevitable. If we see these reigns as operational cycles rather than personal lifespans, the Sumerian record transforms from fantastical myth into the most ancient corporate ledger in existence, detailing the deployment and duration of off-world supervisors. If these concepts resonate, if the meticulous density of the evidence presented throughout this investigation has stirred a feeling that the official narrative is woefully incomplete, I invite you to pause and consider joining this community of inquiry. Press the like button if this interpretation moves you closer to a truth you instinctively recognized, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss the continuation of this deep dive into the hidden layers of our past. I also urge you to share your deepest insights in the comments section below. Do you feel this chronological contraction was accidental or engineered? Your reflection is vital to piecing together this vast historical tapestry. The definitive punctuation mark in this cosmic calendar remains the flood, the Abubu, the Great Purification. This was the calibration point, the moment the Anunnaki timeline ceased its direct interaction and yielded to the development of autonomous human civilization. Before the flood, the long reigns defined the era of direct governance, a period of tutelage and rapid superhuman development. After the flood, the kingship was shortened, becoming fallible, dying, and subject to conventional earthly constraints. This wasn't merely a geological event. It was a sovereign decision to reset the experiment, changing the parameters of the timeline from eternal oversight to probationary self-governance. The deluge did not just wipe clean the face of the earth, it wiped clean the slate of cosmic authority, leaving humanity to manage the inherited burden of an immensely advanced but suddenly leaderless civilization. We inherited the mathematics, the architecture, and the astronomical knowledge of Sumer, without understanding the full scope of the beings who imparted them. We inherited the debt of technology without the accompanying wisdom of its originators. And yet, did they truly leave? Or did they merely transition to the role of the unseen observers? The persistence of myths across nearly every culture, describing gods who retreat to mountain peaks, remote islands, or deep space, suggests not an absolute departure, but a strategic withdrawal. The long reigns may have concluded their primary phase, but the supervision itself could be eternal. The very concept of kingship lowered from heaven implies a mechanism of control, a system that can be activated and deactivated. The silence that followed the normalization of the king list, the post-deluge period, is the silence of the control room when the primary staff steps away, leaving automated systems to run the routine operations. We, the inheritors of that broken timeline, have been operating in a state of self-declared autonomy, perhaps unaware that our every historical movement is being monitored by those who set the entire apparatus in motion thousands of years ago. This brings us to the most urgent question of the final revelation. What triggers the end of the pause? If the initial long reigns were tied to celestial cycles, then the ultimate conclusion of the Anunnaki timeline must be tied to a cosmic signal, a definitive return. The concept of Nibiru, Planet X, or the returning home world, is not merely an ancient astrological prediction. It is the ultimate schedule for the re-engagement of the original managers. The long reigns were the time spent waiting for the alignment or preparing for the arrival. The short human reigns are the time spent in absence, when that astronomical body returns to the inner solar system, completing its immense 3,600-year orbit. The parameters change, the control mechanism reactivates, and the king list, the record of management, must logically resume. This cyclical anticipation is not unique to Sumer. It is the core convergence of prophecies worldwide. From the Vedic concept of the yugas, the vast cyclical ages that define human moral and physical descent and ascent, to the Mesoamerican calendars that anticipated definitive restarts, the evidence suggests a universal awareness of scheduled intervention. All these ancient systems recognize that our current short timeline is merely a brief, manageable segment within a much larger cosmological framework. They all anticipate the moment when the great year concludes and the architects of the first civilization return to assess the quality of the stewardship. The conclusion, then, is not a dramatic, singular event, but the silent, inevitable closing of a cycle. This forces us to confront the ultimate question of authority. If the initial kingship was appointed by non-human intelligence, if our very civilization sprang fully formed from their direct intervention, can we truly claim sovereign autonomy? Are we masters of our own destiny, or are we simply operating within the confines of a sandbox created, managed, and observed by those who initiated the long reigns? The timeline of the ancient kings suggests that human history is not a continuous, evolutionary progression, but a meticulously segmented program, with the long reigns defining the era of setup and the short reigns defining the period of testing. The silent conclusion to the Anunnaki timeline is simply this: the timeline is not finished. It is merely paused. The sudden, unnatural contraction of the king list after the flood, the swift transition from immortality to mortality, was the signal that the primary supervisors had initiated the withdrawal protocol. We are living in the temporal echo of their immense presence, managing the civilization they engineered, awaiting the sign that their great orbital cycle has brought them back to the calibration point. The true conclusion to the reign of the ancient kings lies not in dusty archaeological sites, but in the future, when the cyclical nature of time asserts itself once more. The long reigns are not a historical curiosity, they are a prophecy of return. If you have journeyed through this intensive exploration, if you have remained captivated by the density of the evidence and the implications of this immense historical contraction, you are now part of a unique and dedicated community committed to understanding the deepest secrets of our past. I urge you now to solidify your place in this investigation. Please consider subscribing to the channel to support the tireless work of uncovering these hidden truths. Give this video a like if the convergence of prophecy and history has offered a new perspective on our origins. And to finalize this complex chapter, engage with the conclusion by commenting the words, "Shifting the epoch." This collective act of recognition marks our transition from simply observing the past to preparing for the future. Our investigation into the long reigns ends here, but the journey to understand the architects of time continues. Please join me in the next featured inquiry appearing on your screen now, as we continue to chase the shadows that define human civilization.